Okay. All right. Good evening, everybody. We have Wendy and Charles Outwhaite here. It's 4:30 in the morning where they are in West Sussex, and they were kind enough to get up. They say they were going to be kind of working anyway. I don't know if I believe that entirely at 4:30, but good for them if they were. But it's awesome to have you guys, and I'm looking forward to hearing about Ambriel again. Wendy tells a great story, and hopefully you guys enjoy. So with that, Wendy, I'll kind of let you take off on just talking about Ambriel as a whole, and maybe start with where you are and what you grow, and then we'll go from there.
Sure. So Charles and I, we have a 9.5 hectare estate, which is about sort of 25 acres of Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, and Pinot Meunier down in the south of England. So if you took a line from London and went down to the sea, we're probably about halfway along. And we're in West Sussex. And it's very beautiful. There are sort of rolling green hills. If you just imagine, I don't know, like Lord of the Rings countryside in the Shires or something. It's a bit like that. It's rolling and green. And
a few hobbits.
Only me. And it's, it's England, so it's cool climate, viticulture, and we just make sparkling here. So we're a little bit to the north of Champagne, but we make fizz. Yeah.
So what makes England a great place for champagne style sparkling wine?
Well, it's all about the climate window, isn't it, really? So we have, as you probably know, a long time ago, we all used to be part of the same landmass. So we have very much the same sort of geology as mainland Europe, so in Champagne. So in fact, there's a chalk seam that runs from Champagne through Paris, underneath the Channel, and then goes across the three counties of the south of England, Kent, Sussex, and Hampshire. We're in fact on green sand because it's better where it's a little bit cooler and damper. So we have similar geology, and Champagne, like most of the viticultural world, is getting hotter and hotter. And because we're a bit more northerly, we are cooler. And that means that we can produce those grapes that still retain a freshness, so the acidity is still there, which means we can age the wine. Because as you know, for sparklings, you make what we call base wine and what other people call wine. And then we pop it in a bottle with some yeast and sugar in the traditional method to make it fizzy. And you leave it there for years. I mean, typically our wines are left more than 5 years in the bottle. And to be able to age, you need to have a little bit of that sort of freshness there. Otherwise you'd have a sort of a flabby, Coca-Cola type bubble, it would just be sweet, and we want it to be a little bit more refreshing and moreish than that. So you need to have your fruit to ripen, but you also need to have some acidity. And from the fruit ripening, you need a really long ripening season. So we had bud burst in April, but probably we won't harvest these grapes until typically right at the beginning of October. So a really, really long ripening season where the grapes just slowly put on phenolics. And that just makes for great fruit flavors. So yeah, I think when you were here last year, we had harvested in a cool time. And so, yeah, it was a bit challenging sometimes in England. You never know what the weather's going to throw at you. But usually we make really fantastic wines.
Yeah, they are really fantastic. So when she's talking about freshness and she referred to acidity, they're not bashful with leaving what I would call a high amount of acidity, which does allow their wine to age a lot longer and can continue to evolve. And when Pierce and I were over there visiting about the last week of January, and if you taste these wines before we were tasting them while they were still, they weren't sparkling, but in their first year or so, the acidity, while it's still relatively high now, is searing. It's really interesting to see how it evolves from right when it's very young to now, where it's very nice, and it's kind of feels like a leap of faith for you guys to say we're going to leave that much on there to know that it's going to end up like this. It's a pretty neat process. Talk to me about how you guys got into wine, what your life path was before, and kind of why you ended up wanting to make sparkling wine where you are.
Well, we both love drinking wine, so that's how we got into it. We started.
That's true. They do.
Yeah. I mean, throughout our lives, we've always had an interest in wine. So wine and food initially, and then we, started doing some of our WSET exams, and we do a bit of judging of wines for international competitions. And in the early 2000s, we tasted some English sparkling. So up until then, English wine perhaps hadn't been very good. It was still, and it was made from a lot of Teutonic varieties, and it was usually the winemaking wasn't very advanced either, and it wasn't a pleasure to drink. So if anyone ever gave you a glass of English, you slightly braced yourself and fixed your smile, and just had to put yourself through it as a matter of discipline and politeness. And then sparkling came along. So I think the first sparkling vineyards was actually done by the Mosses, who are Americans, and they planted a vineyard called Nightimber, and everyone thought they were completely nuts, that we would never ripen Chardonnay and Pinot, and it's going to be a disaster. And of course it wasn't. It was absolutely fantastic. So in the 2000s, we tasted some early English sparkling and thought, actually, this is genuinely good, because what's the point in just making more bad wine? There just isn't. So I feel that we tasted it and we were really impressed, and it was a light bulb moment. And then we thought, okay, we'll do this. We'll find the site. And it took us 5 years to find our site. We started one side of the south of England and went over to the other. And then irritatingly, my father-in-law in the local paper said, oh, I've got the perfect place. My father-in-law, who's a darling, but he didn't know anything about vines or grapes or wines or anything. And we thought, oh, another weekend ruined. And it was this place. So yeah. So we bought it, and in 2006, and we planted in 2008. And we had very fixed ideas about what we wanted. So we didn't want champagne clones. We wanted Burgundian clones because they were better for flavors and whatever. And so yeah, we took it from there. But that's how we got in. We just like wine.
So I don't know if I've ever asked you. I probably have asked you this. Why instinctually did you go to the Dijon or Burgundian clones instead of Champagne? I mean, they are more flavorful, but why did you know to do that?
We just thought the grapes were better. I mean, as you know, you can do an enormous amount of research and reading and wandering around people's vineyards and doing your exams and listening to everyone. Everyone always has a slightly different way of doing things, and they're totally convinced that their way is the only way. And I think sometimes, particularly in a new wine region like ours, you have to just pause and say, okay, well, why do they do it that way? And does it make sense here? And so I think, as I say, where the world's getting hotter, where quite a lot of viticulture these days is trying to avoid sunburn on the grapes, that's not an issue that we really face very much. We don't have irrigation problems here in England. It just falls from the sky. So
you have the opposite problem.
Yes, exactly. So we need to try to focus on what it is that's good about growing grapes here. I mean, basically, we just don't have specialized grape diseases or pests or whatever, because we haven't had vineyards for 300 years or whatever. So focus on what's good, and the things that are challenging, then manage according to those challenges. And so quite a lot of the stuff immediately goes out of the window. But when it all comes down to it, no matter how careful you are, the answer is in the grape. You need to just go and taste those grapes. And the differences between the clones, I mean, we just found that Burgundian clones were much better. And if you're going to plant a vineyard, it's a bit of a long-term plan. So you may as well plant the grapes with the flavors that you actually like. Otherwise, life is going to be a bit dull.
Yeah, I agree. Your guys' wine has more character on it than a lot of champagne, in my opinion, especially in its youth. You're not totally relying on the autolytic characters that champagne relies on in the same way. I appreciate that. So I think it was a great idea. So much so that I thought I'd try it myself.
I'm very excited about this.
Yeah, we'll see how that goes. Pierce and I, we like their idea enough and their climate's enough similar that we bought some of the same clones on the same rootstocks and are going to try it here in the Seattle area. And we'll know, about a decade from now if that was any good. But hopefully it'll be interesting. I think it's a really, so that's a great question. We just got a question asking what year Ambriel we're drinking. So maybe I'll have you guys kind of talk about, let's talk about the wines and why this one doesn't have a year versus some of your ones that do have years and some of the other styles you guys make.
So the first one, should we talk about the classic cuvee?
Yeah, that's the one we're drinking. So let's go with that one.
Brilliant. Okay, so we make essentially sort of two styles of wine. One are the vintage wines, which clearly come from a single year, and the others are the non-vintage. And our non-vintage wines are a blend of different years. So we hold wine back in reserve from year to year to year to age and then to blend into wines for every year. And most of our wines are stored in steel tank to keep them fresh and fruity, but we do a little bit in oak barrels and Burgundy oak barrels, not to give oak flavor, but to give a little bit of softness and roundness and vanilla to the taste. But very imperceptible. It's all part of the overall blend. And our classic cuvee that you're drinking at the moment is a multi-vintage year from mainly from 2013 and 2014. It's in terms of grape composition, it is, I think from memory, 70% Pinot Noir and 30% Chardonnay clones with a little bit of Pinot Meunier in it. It's 11% alcohol, so quite low. We don't feel that the wines need a lot of alcohol to be able to express themselves, which I think is another sort of big advantage to our wines, is they're very drinkable and you can keep drinking them without falling over. And this has been bottled, therefore, in 2015, in late May of that year, and therefore was on its bottle lees for at least 4 years, maybe 4.5 years before we disgorged it. So that's the other factor that we have in all our wines, is this long lees aging. So even our non-vintage wines have a long time on the lees to get those autolytic flavors. But I think hopefully what you're also picking up from the wine is that it's got the autolysis, but as Wendy was talking about earlier, it also has and retains all of its fruit flavors, which I think is what makes it different and special from an ordinary traditional method wine is that it combines both autolysis and fruit in a very interesting and I think quite unique way. I mean, us in particular, but English sparkling wines in general. For those who are sort of interested in the detail, it's been dosed. As you know, virtually all traditional method sparkling wines has a little bit of sugar added during the disgorgement process. This is a brut wine, so a dry wine, and it has 8.5 grams of sugar added at dosage. And then we leave it on its cork to age and to recover from the disgorgement process, and it's been on its cork for at least 6 months before you release it.
So I'm going to pause here for just a second. Let's I'm going to go back and define terms, and maybe we can go over the process a little bit for anybody who's not familiar with it. So lees are the dead yeast cells. After they're done fermentation, they die off and they settle out. And then we were talking about autolysis or autolytic characters there. That's the breakdown of these lees or dead yeast cells. And what they do over time is they tend to add, they can add a softer texture as well as kind of brioche or bready type characters that they can integrate really nicely with the fruit. I'll let you guys kind of discuss what traditional method is as a whole, which is also, sometimes you'll hear it as the champagne method. And so these terms get kind of bounced around interchangeably. So if you guys would mind describing that whole process, that'd be great.
Sure. So, I mean, this is a little known fact, but actually, this traditional method, this way of making fizz, started in England in 1665, about 100 years before the people in Champagne got it. So, and the reason why is because of glass making technology and that kind of, it's always a breakthrough and whatever. But I have to say our PR has been, as I say, about 200 years behind everybody else. So, you know, where you go, the English. But what you do is you take your wine, and once you've decided your blend, so as Charles said, the vintage ones obviously come from the same year, but we taste, in fact, we made the Stickneys do blending trials with us for a Blanc de Noir, which we'll see in 6 years' time or whatever. But it's, you take your blends, and for us, because we do each clone separately, there are lots of different choices to make. But once you've decided, you take your wine and you put it into a champagne bottle, and you add a little bit of yeast and a little bit of sugar as the yeast food. And then you put a crown cap, which is like a beer bottle top, on it. And then you put the wine somewhere cool and you let it re-ferment. So what happens there is that as yeast ferments in the wine and eats all the sugars, it gives off carbon dioxide. And if it's in a tank or a barrel, then the gas just escapes through the wood or whatever. But if it's in a bottle and it can't escape, it's got no option but to dissolve into the wine and make it bubbly. And the big breakthrough, I think, was in 1665, was that we copied cider makers by adding the sugar. So the yeast goes away and it makes its bubbles and makes its more alcohol, and then it dies when it runs out of food. And as James was saying, this then makes the bottle lees. People call it the bottle lees because calling it dead yeast doesn't sound very romantic. But what it does is inside the bottle, it changes the flavors of the wine. And it's usually you get those sort of, as you say, bready, brioche type flavors. But you can also, if you age for a very long time, you can get sort of nuttiness. I mean, I typically get hazelnuts, but other nuts are available. I did, this is a very, I'm slightly ashamed of this, but I did torture the Stickneys when they were over, in that I made them taste Marmite, which is a weird English, we spread it on things. It's a very salty yeast-baked product. I think it's a byproduct from, I don't know, brewing or something. And
also vegetable You also hear it as Vegemite sometimes, right?
Yeah. And it's not a flavor that most non-English people like. In fact, that
I seem to recall going back for seconds. That was also after she made us breakfast.
I'm so impressed by that, because usually people are sort of, tongue-scrapingly revolted by Marmite, but
I don't have to think very hard about how it tasted, though. I remember it very clearly. It's pretty similar.
yeah, sometimes you can get a Marmite taste in very old wines that have been left on the lees for a very long time. So the reason why, and also the wine, I mean, basically, you can never sip the same wine twice. Wines are always evolving. And by the long aging on the bottle lees, the flavor profiles and also the texture of the wine changes. So that's secondary fermentation, and that is the magic. And there are lots of different ways of getting bubbles into wine. You can, carbonate it like Coca-Cola. You can use the Charmat method, where you sort of pressurize in a tank. You can even use soda stream if you're patient enough, but this is I think the only way where you get a lovely little refined bubble, where actually the flavors of the wine are allowed to evolve in the way that we hope is delightful.
Yeah, it makes a much nicer bubble. We had a call Wednesday with a New Zealand producer, and they produce a sparkling wine. There's a reason that they tend to not produce Sauvignon Blanc in the traditional method, and the flavors of the breakdown don't go very well with the other flavors of Sauvignon Blanc. So she was talking about how they do it with Prosecco, which is the Charmat or tank method, and then that they also will carbonate it. And while that oftentimes would be maybe looked down on in some ways, for Sauvignon Blanc, it's a very good way of producing it, and doing it the way that Wendy and Charles do is not necessarily the best way for that particular grape. So it's just kind of a sidebar, since we were talking about their sparkling the other night. So I think that was a really good overview of the way you do that. This room had a question about Pinot Noir being a red grape, and this not being a red wine. And but you have noticed that they have a rosé. And so can you kind of talk about, so the original grapes in Champagne were also Pinot Noir, Pinot Meunier, and Chardonnay, which two of the three of those are red-skinned or dark-skinned grapes. Why do these not end up with pigmentation in the wine?
So what you do, in Champagne, they used to call them vin gris, grey wines, which doesn't sound very nice, does it? But it's literally, you take for the Chardonnay, obviously that's white grape, we're going to get white juice. But for the Pinot Noir and for the Pinot Meunier, you take your grape, and then we whole bunch press it. That means that you don't sort of chop it up and take the stalks out before you press it. And you are just, if you have the berry, if you were just to squeeze it, the bit that would come out is the only bit that we squeeze it like this,
exactly.
like this.
Each one individually, Wendy does it, more harvest, it's amazing.
No,
sometimes she does it well, other times it's not very good. But.
No, it's in a press where you have a sort of like a balloon that inflates. They hate it when I call it a balloon, but it is true. It just very gently puts pressure on the grapes so that the berries just pop. And the bit that comes out is the bit that we use. So we waste about, it depends on the flavors and where we cut, but it's about sort of 65% of the grape we use and the rest we don't. So anything that's near the skin, we tend not to use. And it means that the juice is clear, and so it will go on to make a white wine, except when it comes to the rosé. Then obviously you get your different grape varieties then go together in blending. So all of the white ones, so the Blanc de Blanc, the classic, the Blanc de Noir. So Blanc de Blanc, white from white, literally white wine from white grapes. Blanc de Noir, white wine from black grapes. So yeah, we have nice, clear, yellowish type juice. But when it comes to the rosé, there are lots of different ways of making rosé, but most often people tip in a bit of white wine and a bit of red wine when they're doing the blending and before it goes into the bottle. Some people just, color their wine even after the wine's finished at disgorging, but we don't do that. So the little 2014 rosé that you have is where we have just one particular clone of Pinot Noir that we've given skin contact in order for it to make it a rosé, but it also affects the flavor profile. So, a good test to do with yourself if you're drinking sparkling rosé is to close your eyes so you don't know whether it is colored pink and see whether you can taste it. And with most sparkling rosés, you can't, I can't. I mean, there's so little Pinot in there. But ours is 100% Pinot with skin contact of that particular clone. And so that's what you're getting in the rosé. So that's why you get clear white sparkling and pink sparkling.
Another question came up. Do you guys use one yeast, multiple yeast, wild ferments, cultured? What's your guys' process there?
Well, I'd love to say we use wild yeast. It sounds romantic and the right thing to do, but we don't. It really sort of goes back to the time of year that we're fermenting. So my assistant winemaker the last couple of years has been doing winemaking before he came to us in the Northern Rhone, where they're sort of picking grapes in August and it's very warm. And the cellars have got lots of natural yeast in the cellars, and it's very easy to get a natural fermentation. We're picking, as Wendy says, in sort of October when it's pretty cool. There is probably much lower chance of you getting an efficient wild fermentation going. So we use special yeasts that are made for sparkling wine. And what we're trying to do is get, it goes back to the point that when we make a base wine, i.e. the wine before you make it sparkling, you want to retain its fresh fruit characteristics. You want to do a cool ferment on it. You want that ferment to be consistent and reasonably strong and to start and to finish in an effective way. And that means you need to add a proper yeast to it in order to achieve that. So long answer, I'm afraid, is that we use commercial yeast, especially for sparkling wine, to do the job. Oops.
Ooh.
Sorry, I got myself stuck on mute there. Yeah, I mean, like you said, I think there is a romanticized vision of using wild ferments, and that's become maybe more of a thing in the last few years. A lot of producers you would know, and a lot of really famous and well-known producers have little to no interest in making really, really great wine with wild ferments, because you lose a lot of control, and some of the great things that can come out of wild ferments can also be mirrored by some really negative things. So it's pretty risky. And I think with sparkling, those potential faults can be magnified so much by the bubbles that even if you could do it with temperature, it may not always be what you want. So,
but I think also, I mean, the yeast that you use for primary fermentation to make your base wines is one thing, but also for your secondary fermentation, I'm really trying to do secondary fermentation in the bottle, which is quite a challenging environment for fermentation with a non-commercial yeast, would be very, very tricky. I mean, no one does it. So I think that well, you'd get a surprise, wouldn't you, in 6 years' time when you open it up and see what happens? I mean, you might not have a bubble.
Yeah.
Yes, that might not be the best surprise. I'm gonna throw a few pictures up here so people can kind of see. strangely, a lot of these are kind of at twilight or before the sun was really up. But
I don't know if that's strange, James. We woke up before the sun came up, and we're
I mean,
walking,
yeah,
and we
yeah.
left today. So,
Okay, well,
Yeah.
context
So
there, I
to a
guess.
puzzle, which Wendy finished.
Oh, that puzzle.
I'm a little sad we didn't get to finish that puzzle.
Well, you know what, Piers? I'm more than happy to pop it in a bag for you.
All right, cool.
I'm absolutely okay with that.
So when they invited us over, the kind of history here is that the company I work for represents Wendy and Charles out here in Seattle, and Wendy was out here on a visit, and we became friends, and Pierce and I were over for our one of our wine program graduations in London, and they invited us to come down. And the picture you're looking at here is they said it'd be fine. You could stay in our barn, and I expected a barn, and it was very much not a barn. It was the nicest barn I've ever been in. And so, yeah, so this is their barn, which is surrounded by their vineyard here. And like she said, it's just these green rolling hills. And there's a lot of history that's kind of gone on here that maybe we kind of lose in the United States, where there were some really cool artifacts that were found on their property as they were kind of digging things up, and the hills that are kind of there were I guess architecturally landscaped to fight battles on. These are their sheep that they had frost. They were frostbitten sheep that day because it, like I said, it was cold. But these guys kind of wander the vineyard here as well, and yeah, it's just you can kind of see that the vineyard kind of drops off to more hills and mountains out there as you head towards the sea. But yeah, it's just a really stunning to grow grapes and make some great wine. So what other questions can we answer for you guys? Pierce, anything else that you want to kind of dig into also that I left out?
Not
Oh, yeah.
off the top of my head, but I'm sure
the classic.
Yeah, food pairings with the classic. Let's dig into that.
You do that one.
Sparkling wine
so-
is not necessarily the easiest pairing.
Well, of course, we're Brits, so fish and chips is an obvious thing. Go for it. Any seafood and fish is really good, but because of the freshness that you've got, it's also really good with anything where you've got fat in the food. So we often do a pairing with lots of cheeses. It's really good with Hontu. It goes with lots of shellfish, obviously, and anything where, so for instance, if you had a chicken with morels, some sort of mushroom or whatever, then very often that works very well too. So if you have anything where you've got anything in your sauce, your cream or whatever, that will cut through. Weirdly, I was with a wine critic over here who was saying, you should have it with lamb. And I thought, this is never going to work. I would normally not drink a white wine with lamb. But I've tried it, and I understand what he's saying. It's because of the very fatty content of lamb. So there's a cut through with the fizz. But I think it's much better with fish or chicken, really.
Sushi. As well as sushi.
Yeah, of course.
Mm-hmm.
I have some American friends who come from Montana, and they have a favorite Japanese restaurant over here. And quite embarrassingly, because you're not allowed to take your own wine into this restaurant, and they turn up anyway with a bottle of our fizz, and I think are just indulged by the restaurant owners have given up. They now just say, well, this is the way. So, sushi, it's a good mix.
I hadn't thought about sushi. I love sushi, so that's a great idea. I'll try that.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
the one we didn't talk about a little bit was they also have we talked about the rosé a little bit, and I would love to get that for anybody who'd like to try it. It's a really fantastic wine. Pierce and I actually served it at our winery's investors dinner that we put together as one of our food and wine pairings. But they also have a 2010 that they've kind of held that is a vintage. Have you guys done that in other vintages with the Blanc de Blanc, or was 2010 special in some way for you guys where you decided to do that?
In all honesty, 2010 was when we first met our grapes. So we'd spent so much time, finding the site and growing the grapes and wanting these particular clones, so they had to wait an extra year and whatever. And we were completely overexcited. So when the grapes came in, we made every style of sparkling wine you can think of. So Blanc de Blanc, Blanc de Noir, a rosé, a classic, and in fact a demi-sec. And so it was commercially a ridiculous thing to do, but it was really interesting. It just showed you what the grapes were capable of. And I mean, obviously, first harvest, very young grapes, you wouldn't immediately think that this would make a great wine. And it has definitely needed its time on the lees to just become itself. But the Blanc de Blanc is, I think, a great little wine. It's done very well in competitions and its points and things like that. In fact, I think Wine Enthusiast gave it the most points for any English sparkling over there. And it is just, in fact, one particular clone of Chardonnay from the top middle of the vineyard. And it is just great to be able to experiment, to say, look, here's a grape that I really like in this particular position. Let's make a special wine. So that's what we did with the Blanc de Blanc in 2010. We don't do it every year, but we do make vintage Blanc de Blanc and Blanc de Noir when we think we find a parcel of grapes that are just absolutely outstanding. The reason why we don't do it every year is unless it's really, truly sensational, then, what's the point? So, and typically these are aged for a very long time as well. So, yeah, if you want something very interesting, get James to give you the Blanc de Blanc, because, it is, well, you just don't find that many sparklings going back to 2010 that's just from one little parcel of grapes. It's just a really interesting taste experience.
I'd also be happy to get anybody that as well. I've been hoarding some myself. Don't tell anybody.
You're lucky. We're running low of stock. We'll be over to collect.
I know. I heard that.
When did you guys disgorge the Blanc de Blanc?
So we had staggered disgorgements. So I can't actually remember. So it's had, I know it had 9 years on the bottle lees, latest stuff. Yeah, it did.
Okay.
So yeah, it has its time. I could get the date for you.
The ones you're drinking have had 8 years on.
Okay.
So I remember now. So
Okay.
that's been disgorged in late 2018, early 2019. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I have to say, we're very sad that we can't be with you in Seattle for a bit. Global pandemics are very inconvenient.
Soon,
really are.
Soon, it'll happen, or we'll get over there one way or the other. If there's any other questions, shoot them out there, and otherwise, I think we'll pretty much wrap it up there, and we'll let you guys get to your day.
Honestly, it's so beautiful
filtering
out here. The dawn's come up. We're now in light.
Yeah, that sounds awesome. I don't think I'm going to get up at 4:30 to kind of like out of sympathy do that for you tomorrow. Sorry. But yeah, well, I really appreciate you guys coming on. And like I said, I'd love to get anybody else these wines that would love, if you'd like to try either the other two styles or more of this, I'm more than happy to get them out to you guys. And hopefully when you guys come out here, maybe we'll throw something together at the winery and you guys can all come hang out with Wendy and Charles too.
That'll be really good.
Well, we've got lots of things to celebrate, I understand. So next time we're out there.
Yep, that sounds good.
Wendy, Charles, before you guys dash off, hang on 1 second. My wife wanted to say hello because she hasn't had a chance to actually meet you guys. So she's going to come poke her head in real quick.
Okay.
You're coming to say hello?
I am.
Yeah.
I am.
Yeah.
Hi.
Hi there. Hi.
How are you?
Actually,
Oh my gosh.
there we go.
Hi.
Hi. Great to see you.
I would. She's very excited to come visit when we do make it that way.
It's true.
That'd be great. Look
I
forward
know
to
where I
it.
want to visit in the world.
And
Come over as
I
soon as
promise.
possible.
Yeah, we'll bring Lincoln so you guys can get your toddler fix too.
I remember that actually being a threat Wendy made. It wasn't like come over for soon. Well, it's like you better bring her over as soon as possible or else.
Yeah, I'm going to assume we have a get out of jail free card with the global pandemic being a thing.
For a little while.
Okay, perfect. As soon as we can.